Good afternoon, everybody, to the Modern College of Business Science in Muscat, the capital of Oman. Welcome to this webinar, which is about lessons from COVID-19 for climate change and research collaboration. Our speaker today is Professor Daniel Kamen, the Professor of Energy at the University of California, Berkeley, with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, where he served as chair, the Goldman School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center for Environmental Policy, and as a professor in the Department of Nuclear Engineering. Professor Kamen was educated in physics with PhD and a master's degree from Harvard University and a BA from Cornell University. From 2005 to 2015, he directed the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at California University, and he served as professor in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs in Princeton University. Professor Kamen also is a fellow of the American Physical Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2020, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science, and since 1999, Professor Kamen has been a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In terms of public outreach, Professor Kamen has authored or co-authored 12 books, written more than 400 peer-reviewed journal publications with major projects on energy for international development, job creation in the energy and environmental sectors, environmental justice, and the technology pathways to low-carbon economy. He also served in the private sector on the board, or has helped to found 10 companies, including Infas Energy, Solar Micro Company, and many others. At the same time, also, Professor Kamen served at state, federal, and international level. So welcome, Professor Kamen, to this webinar, and the floor is yours.
Thank you all for inviting me. I haven't been to Oman in several years since I was there for the Gulf Science Engineering Council, and I very much appreciate the chance to exchange views not only on clean energy science, but also on some of the pressing policy questions. And as a physicist who works at the intersection of science, technology, and very much our policy debates, I will be trying to share both what we do in terms of innovation, but also in terms of implementation. And I'm hoping the questions will bring even more of this out. If any of the materials from today's talk are interesting to you to study further, this is the website of our laboratory. It's called RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And I very much encourage you to download the slides, download any of the videos that we post there so that you have the materials. And for those of you who use Twitter, I post generally 1 or 2 messages a day about the work in our lab. I'll post today about this webinar, so I'll try to ask you for one of those nice screenshots of all the participants during the Q&A. I'll post that. So this is not my personal post. We post here about the work we're doing. So again, welcome to sharing either link. I hope those are useful for you. And the last time I was actually visiting you, I also spent quite a bit of time at the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, KISR, in Kuwait City, and here we are at the Al Shagaya Wind and Solar Farm, which I hope some of you have had a chance to visit because there's some really important projects going on there, particularly on the energy generation side, but also on some material science to deal with some of the problems of dust annealing to wind turbine blades and also to solar panels. And actually, we've seen several companies that were formed that were joint between Gulf states and California and Gulf states and Canada that came out of the work to tailor some of the energy generations to some of the unique both temperature and also dust issues in the region. But this is again an example of the kind of collaboration that I think you'll see in my slides. I do want to introduce my family because the United States right now is undergoing some very challenging times. We've not only mismanaged the COVID crisis, but we've also undertaken a series of deep conversations about race. And it's become a large concern here. And so my family, as you can see, we are a mixed family. And so we are very much concerned about these issues taking place as we speak. In terms of the first question in the introduction, what's the linkage between COVID and climate? We're really seeing it's a very close issue and close linkage. So this is a recent paper that my laboratory published with partners in China at Tsinghua University, at the Potsdam Climate Institute in Germany, and at the University of British Columbia. And what you see from these snapshots from the whole world, that's in the upper left, and then different countries, United States, Italy, Brazil, many others here, is that as the COVID crisis hit, the energy use dropped in all of these countries individually. It dropped most strongly in China, which you can see in the graph below. And this graph in each case just compares energy use in 2019 at the top in each one to 2020 at the bottom for the first quarter of the year. And instead of looking through each one in detail, you'll notice the scalloped pattern, as we call it, which is showing the weekends where energy demand goes down. But if I just summarize it, around the world, coal use dropped by about 10%, natural gas use dropped by about 4%, and the use of renewables worldwide increased during this time. And there's many interesting reasons for that, one of which is that the fuel costs are zero for renewables. So when demand is down, they were used preferentially because they are simply available, and that the marginal units were really the fossil fuels. And this is an interesting feature because few of us would have thought that our fossil fuel base became the marginal fuel. This paper is available on this xArXiv, which is a physics preprint service. It's now in review right now at Nature, but it highlights that something interesting happened. Now, decreasing our energy use via COVID epidemic is not something anyone recommends in terms of a good strategy or an economically smart one, but it highlights how quickly our energy use can drop. After all, that 10% drop is a significant fraction of the goal we set in the Paris Climate Accords, something which unfortunately countries have moved away from, and my country is to blame partially for that process. But before we get into the bad policy news, I want to bring you good news. This is a snapshot of some of the PhD graduates from my laboratory. I'm very proud of the places they've gone to. They've been, you see upper left, President Obama's science advisor. Gang He was a journalist who became a computational atmospheric chemist. Ryan Shelby is one of my students who is the engineering attaché to both South Africa and Haiti. Majid Azati from Iran is the chief epidemiologist for the City of London. It's a very interesting and diverse group in terms of the types of places they've taken their scientific degrees. And if any of the things I talk about today are of interest to you or to your students, each summer, unfortunately this summer started for us 2 weeks ago, we do offer a series of courses fully online. The course I teach is Energy and Society, and if anyone's interested, just this website here, my department, the Energy and Resources Group, Academics Sustainability, you can actually sign up to take courses that I teach fully online. And even with the time difference to Oman, it's quite easy because all the materials are available on arXiv, a website, and then the discussions are things we do several times a day so people can sign in. One of the features of being at Berkeley that we're quite proud of is that we have a number of Nobel laureates at our campus. And if any of you have visited Berkeley or indeed many of the universities in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in the United States, what you'll see is that you often have these wonderful parking spaces in the middle of campus. This NL stands for Nobel Laureate Parking. And this is in front of our astronomy building. And so this is a very highly respected place to be able to park. And I was very fortunate. I was on a team that was able to share the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for our work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, both assessing the state of climate change and assessing our options to do something about it. And so when we received this Nobel Prize, of course, the four of us at Berkeley wondered, well, we'll be getting these parking places. In fact, one of my colleagues said, well, this wasn't a regular Nobel Prize. This is one where there were about 300 people around the world who shared it. 4 of them were at Berkeley. So my colleague thought that maybe we should get 1/300th of a parking space. In fact, what happened was we did receive parking, but we were of course working on energy and climate, and so the parking we received was not for our vehicles. The parking we received at Berkeley was Nobel laureate parking, but it was for our bicycles. And we like to joke that this is a very climate appropriate response that Berkeley did for us. Now, we know from the climate meetings, especially the Paris climate meeting that happened several years ago, that the global commitment was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we would not warm the planet by more than 2 degrees C. That number has been increased recently to 1.5, or decreased, I should say, but the goal has been made more strict. But unfortunately, for political reasons, we've moved away from it. But one of the things that the COVID crisis has taught us is that those emission reductions can in fact happen quite rapidly. And as we think about recovering from COVID, many governments, my own included, are talking about stimulus packages, investments in the economy to get people back to work. Now, the discussions are very different in Gulf states, in the United States, in South Korea, in Europe. We're seeing different strategies to rebuild our economies. And I highlight that because in the United States, we have an interesting situation. We obviously have a government right now which is not a proponent of treating the planet properly. We certainly hope to change that in the election in November. But if we were to look at the United States today and look at what's the least cost technology to install tomorrow morning, so we call that the overnight cost. That's the CapEx, the capital cost of a project. This is a map of the United States. This is not produced at Berkeley, which is considered a left-leaning, a liberal state. This is produced at the University of Texas, a very much a red state or a more conservative state. And so I use their website just to remove any California green bias. And so if we look at the United States map today, these are the technologies that would be the least cost based on the region of the country and the resource if we install overnight. And the sort of the rust color here is where natural gas is the least cost. There's a small pocket where nuclear would be the cheapest. There's the middle of the country in green where wind power would be the least cost. And then there's some areas both in the south and in the north where solar is the least cost, and again in parts of the Carolinas in the southwest. Now, this is where my science and the politics will start to intersect, because here we have a situation where this is the overnight cost. If there's no cost on emitting fossil fuels, not by a cap and trade or not by a tax. But of course, that's not the case where I live in California. It's not the case in British Columbia. It's not the case in Quebec, where we all have a price of carbon. In fact, Quebec, British Columbia, and California have just about the same price of carbon, and that would be a pollution penalty of $20 US per ton of CO2 emitted. So if I use this website and dial up that price, at $20 a ton, the map shifts. Here you can see the amount of solar has increased. The amount of wind has increased a bit. The big loser was natural gas. where the areas where it's the least cost has decreased. That's the market today in my part of the United States. California is the 5th largest economy on the planet. We're just about 20% of the US economy. So that gives you a feeling for what it might be in these areas. And my economist friends around the world actually think that even this market price is not accurate. The price for carbon emissions, if we were to use the so-called social cost of carbon, which includes local air pollution problems, it includes the cost of agriculture and other features, that cost would actually be more like $50 US a ton. If I put that number in, you see the map really has transformed. I'll go back to the first one, and I'll move ahead again to $50 a ton, where solar is the largest chunk in the western part of the United States. In the southeast, there's wind. There's a tiny, tiny bit remaining where natural gas and where nuclear would be the least cost technologies. This is a world, of course, that is compliant, that fits with that Paris Climate Accord. That's not the world we're in today, because in California we don't have this price, but we do have this price in Sweden. We have this price that is projected to come to parts of the European Union. We think the price in British Columbia will rise to that. And China, which launched this same price, $20 a ton most recently, is now looking at what their price would be down the line. So we have a situation where this world is not that unfamiliar to our planning opportunities. And I really highlight that because the path that California is on is interesting and instructive. Our proposal passed into law in 2006 was that by 2010, we would be 20% powered by renewable energy, by green energy systems. We did not make that goal. We only hit 20% in 2013, which makes it sound like we're actually behind schedule. But in fact, if we look at a little more detail, California hit our 2010 target for renewables in 2013, and our target for 2020 of 1/3 powered by renewables, we achieved that in 2016. So only 3 years after hitting 20%, we were already at 33% by ramping up large-scale solar and wind like that Al Shagaya plant I showed you in Kuwait. In fact, we've done so well that today we are at about 37% powered by renewables, and our goal for 2030 was to be 50% powered by renewables. But because of this progress, myself and many others worked with the governor at the time. It was Governor Schwarzenegger from movie fame, and we passed a new law, Senate Bill 100, that set our target for 2045 to be 100% powered by renewables, and to also increase our target for 2030 to be 60% powered by renewables. Now, what's interesting about this is that California has a very specific definition of renewable. We count solar, wind, geothermal energy, and ocean energy, offshore wind or tidal energy. We don't count large hydro, and we don't count nuclear in those targets. That's different. China does count them. New York State, where I'm from, they do count them. Obviously, with the new nuclear plants going into the Gulf region, one might argue that might be appropriate there, but that's a choice. But our renewables target includes transportation. That means our 2045 goal includes a significantly increased demand as we look to power all of California's 15 million vehicles with renewable energy as well. And I say that because one of the interesting intellectual issues, which started off as purely a case of intellectual investigation that became policy, is that California uses a life cycle approach, which means we look at the life cycle, the cradle to grave impact of mining fossil fuels, of accessing the lithium for our electric batteries, for disposing nuclear waste fuels. We put that all into the equation, And that's led to a controversial decision. And that is California has debated and discussed the issue of what does it mean to truly go green. Even if we meet our target of 100% clean energy in 2045 or 60% clean energy in 2030, if we're still invested in fossil fuels, which of course a very different story in the Gulf than here, many of us, myself included, from a scientific perspective, consider that not to be clean energy based because our economic system is still very much based in fossil fuels. Of course, this might be a more delicate matter depending on where you are, and the Gulf states are right on the edge of that. So here's an op-ed opinion piece I wrote in the California paper in 2013. We debated this, opinions vary, there are still people who disagree, but just last year, the California faculty, my colleagues at the University of California, we voted to divest our financial holdings from fossil fuels. And in fact, just a month ago, the University of California system became the largest university in the United States to divest from fossil fuels. We have many partners in this. We have also others who disagree. But we are in a process to divest. The university I went to as an undergraduate, Cornell, has also agreed to divest, but they've agreed to do so by mid-century, by 2050. Some people think that's appropriate, gives much time for the transition. Others think it's too slow. It is simply a topic of debate, but it's one that has many interesting features in terms of combining our physical sciences with our economic sciences. In terms of implementing this energy transition, some of the laws that we've passed are particularly appropriate for places like Oman, and I hope we'll have some conversation about this at the end. One of the laws that we passed to encourage this transition was to take advantage of the falling prices for solar and to put this into policy, put this into regulation. And so one of the things that we've done is to require that every single new home built in California after January 1st of this year must generate as much energy over the course of a year as it consumes. That doesn't mean they have to be energy independent every second. It means that the net usage averaged over 12 months. A new home must be grid neutral. Buying from the grid during the cloudy seasons or at night, and selling back during the other times of the year. So here are homes. These are homes that are being finished in a new housing development in Southern California, and you can see both single-family homes and multi-family homes with solar on the roof. You can see multiple cars out front, and these homes all have enough solar and enough energy efficiency so that they qualify. Now, 1 out of every 5 homes built in the entire United States is built in California. That's not a good thing, but it does mean that this science to policy decision has quite a large impact across our economy overall. So here we have an example of putting a policy in place that not only greens our energy mix, but also helps to drive down the price of solar itself. And it's because of that work that I was asked to join the Obama administration. Here I am with Secretary of State at that time, John Kerry, and I traveled to the Gulf region, to Oman, to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia as part of those efforts. Here I am with President Obama at an event as well, and I will now veer into United States politics because I was serving in this role of science envoy, which is essentially an energy ambassador. I worked primarily in the Middle East and in Africa during this time. And some of the achievements really led to the climate agreement in Paris. This is, in my opinion, the famous handshake between President Obama and President Xi, where they agreed at the time to cut emissions dramatically in both the United States and China. In fact, the US at that time agreed to cut emissions by 1/3 by 2025, and China agreed to cut their emissions, to peak their emissions in 2030. Well, things have changed. President Obama is no longer our president. President Xi is still the president of China. With the change to President Trump, the United States has left the Paris Climate Accord. President Xi, however, announced 2 years ago that China will now peak their emissions by 2025, not 2030, and then decrease from there. And with the COVID epidemic, China has announced that they think they might have peaked their emissions in 2019, 11 years ahead of schedule. And if not in 2019, it will certainly be peaked in 2020. So China met their goal 10 years early. Now, of course, these nice days for me working in the State Department, something I hope to return to at some point, led to some really wonderful features. When President Obama left office, he wrote me a very nice letter thanking me. But as of course you all know, we had a change of administration. When President Trump came in, I felt I needed to resign for reasons that have to do with climate as well as international leadership. I did resign. I did write my letter to the president explaining my decision, but because I was both a scientist and quite angry at the step away from being an international partner in climate, I did embed a little message inside my letter called an acrostic, where we use the first letter of each paragraph to spell out another statement, a hidden message, if you will. I did that. I also asked the person who I think is the most well-known acquaintance of mine if she would retweet my letter. She did so. The letter is on Twitter. Her kindness, she retweeted it. It was J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter. And by the end of the first day, the message had gotten quite a bit of traction. And I highlight this because, in my opinion, scientists really need to look at their science carefully and, when appropriate, take political steps to express their opinion. So this is me using my physics background, the work in my laboratory, to really highlight where I think the United States has gone off target. And I know that the main topic of today's talk is not the politics, but we're in an era with fires in Australia, with heat waves in Siberia, with fires in California, with droughts in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, that thinking these issues through is really a responsibility of an engaged scientist. And I have to say, it's not just scientists. This is just a little bit over 2 years ago when the Swedish high school student, then a 15-year-old Greta Thunberg, had her strike for climate. This is her in front of the Swedish parliament. It's quite a lonely scene there for her 2 years ago. But if we jump forward to today, the largest group events in human history have been the climate strikes we've seen around the world and the Climate Fridays, the sort of so-called Fridays for the Future events, where even if you missed the early strike, as you can see, most people missed it with Greta, now every Friday there's one of these events. They're different now with COVID, but this is an opportunity where not only youth, but others are expressing their view on a need for an energy transition. And of course, this is not true just in places that are rich in solar or wind. This is also true for places that are rich in fossil fuels. California is the third largest producer of oil in the United States, behind only Alaska and Texas, third largest producer of natural gas. And we have committed, as you see, to this transition that many thought would be very costly to our economy. But in fact, by maximizing the use of renewable energy, we think we will make this transition at a profit. And one of the pieces of science that really gives us faith is the so-called learning curve, or Moore's law. You'll notice this graph is in log space. Time is just a stamp along the curve. This is the log of price versus the log of total production along the x-axis. And this relationship, while not basic economic theory, this is empirical economics, shows very clearly. In fact, we represent the so-called learning curve as the cost in the future at time 2 versus relative to the cost at time 1 follows a power law of the volume of production of solar panels. This price has taken solar from the 1970s as the most expensive technology to today, one of the cheapest. In fact, the new solar plant just recently installed in Dubai came in at just over 1 US cent per kilowatt hour. Incredibly inexpensive. No fossil fuel, no nuclear, no large hydro can match that price. And so in your region, even though there's of course a great wealth of fossil fuels, there's even greater wealth of solar. But the trick is not only to recognize that for some large scale plants like the Al Shagaya one I showed you in Kuwait, but to do so from every rooftop in urban areas and to really think about this new energy economy. And if you think that that learning curve for solar is ending, in fact, the material science revolution is absolutely fascinating. We already have technologies today, commercial companies that are selling transparent solar so that office buildings can also make this transition. We have photovoltaics, solar that can be placed in reservoirs in the Gulf, in offshore areas to increase solar even in areas that are land constrained, such as Bangladesh or Japan. We have solar that's now embedded in fabrics and clothing. So the material science of clean energy is very positive. And some people might say, well, this is only the case for solar. In fact, that's certainly not the case. Here is that exact same learning curve for energy storage. Now here, I've put several curves together. Lithium ion is the blue triangles here. Lead acid batteries are over here. Pumped hydro, sending water or rock uphill or up towers is here. But we have flow batteries, we have lithium ion, we have a variety of technologies all grouped together, and you can see that they are also learning or improving as we install more and more of them. And that's one of the reasons why, no matter how good is our basic science, we're not going to achieve this low carbon economy that the planet needs unless we push with policy. If we push these targets, like California on our solar roofs for electric vehicles, we can drive the prices down there. China right now is the world leader in electric vehicles. And here's an example of a storage facility. This is in Southern California outside Los Angeles. These are two of these liquid flow batteries. Here are the solar panels to power this. And this is a 1 megawatt hour battery that our state regulators chose instead of natural gas to provide shoring up, to provide backup energy when we don't have enough sun and wind. In fact, the other part of the story is a topic which some people are now discovering is very important. I mentioned that my own family is a mixed race family. And so one of our projects is a partnership with Google, where we did something that borders between the science and the economics. And so what we did is we looked at which homes across the United States have solar. And we did so with an eye to look at racial issues and racial justice. And the real challenge here is that we used Google's data for all of rooftops to identify who has solar, and we used our census data to look at who has what level of income. The results are quite striking. What we found is that for communities that are dominated by people of my race, white, solar is more common than in the average community. For Latino, people from Latin America, it's 20% less likely. And for African American households, it's up to 70% less likely because of socioeconomic and other forms of discrimination. So this result is one that moves out of my main area of science into this really challenging issues and area of the socioeconomics. Now, I mentioned the work in China, and I'll conclude with some interesting examples of what's going on there. My laboratory is partnered with a number of universities in China, and one of our efforts was to build a model of the Chinese power system to look at the economics of the transition to clean energy. So our partners here with Tsinghua University, with Sichuan University, North Carolina Electric Power University, and Chongqing University led us to build assessments of the economics of solar and wind and electric vehicles and other technologies. In fact, the results are quite striking. I mentioned that China is the currently world leader in electric vehicles. They have more than 5 million electric vehicles on the road today. California is the second most populous place for electric vehicles. We have a goal for 2020 of 1 million electric vehicles. We're at 800,000 today. And so between now and the end of the year, we're very much hoping we can meet that target, but we'll certainly be close. This is a picture from the southern Chinese city of Shenzhen. Some of you have likely visited. And Shenzhen decided 2 years ago that they would go from under 100 electric taxis to entirely electrifying the fleet. And our laboratory was asked to provide the data sciences for that. And the reason you'll see on the next slide. This is showing taxi drivers receiving their electric taxis. The challenge that we saw in China is that everyone tries to turn in their taxis fully charged to the next driver. And so this is showing when people are waiting to charge, and I'll start this little movie, which won't look like much is happening. This is a queue, this is a line to charge your taxis before the shift change. And you'll notice the vehicles are barely moving. At some of the busiest downtown locations to recharge your vehicle, drivers had to wait up to 45 minutes because there weren't enough charging stations. And even when Shenzhen built more, sometimes when the shift in where taxis went pushed all the cars in one area, you could wait even if there were other stations that had spaces available. So my laboratory built an app, you can see it here, that tells drivers which charging station is available. And we also recommended that certain roads, we might want to have induction charging so that you can recharge your vehicle while you're driving down the road. In fact, China did that. This is a paper that just came out. You can find it on our laboratory website, where we found that just by giving the drivers information, no economic incentives, just a map of which charging stations are occupied and which are not, that we were able to reduce the wait time and increase the income for drivers by 50%, just by marrying energy technology with information technology. And here's the map in Shenzhen. The darker the color, the larger the circle, shows the longer the wait. This is at the present situation, and after we optimized it just 2 weeks later, the waiting lines dropped dramatically. Now, you can see I've talked about material science, I've talked about the energy planning horizon, and I've also at the end talked about this social and racial justice. And this is an issue in every country. Right now, the United States is getting a great deal of attention for the issues about racial profiling by police. And the data I showed using the Google project showed that we have a discrimination problem in who was able to access solar, whether it's because of being denied or because of different economics. Here's an example project. This is one that we started in California, in the city I live in, Oakland. But it's a project I'm now working on in partnership in Morocco with MASEN, the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy. And what we're doing in this case is installing solar on the rooftops. You can see the solar going into these 40 homes here. But unlike a system that simply powers a home directly with solar, in this case, what we're doing is storing all of the energy in this gray garage. We've converted away from cars to energy storage. And from that storage hub, we send the electricity back to all the homes, and we make on-street electric vehicle charging available for those people who don't have a garage to put a car in. So this is a project in energy equity and justice designed to be part of this green energy transition. And so I'll end with this comment I highlighted in the beginning, and that is, as we think about the response from COVID, one of the issues is, can we or will we willing to take advantage of the progress that's been made in clean energy, even for places that have been made rich by fossil fuels, such as Texas and the United States and Alaska? And will we rebuild green? So a letter that the 16 of us authors wrote here, we provided this to every single member of the US House of Representatives and the US Senate, was a green stimulus plan. How can we invest in the technologies I've described in this talk? How can we invest in better research on new solar and wind and storage, energy efficiency? How can we find ways to reinvest in low-income areas, in areas that need more power, by prioritizing green energy over fossil fuels? And in fact, this has gotten quite a bit of attention. We have already passed one stimulus package to emerge from COVID, we hope, although the United States is not doing well in COVID because of some of the political problems I've alluded to before. But investing in clean energy as a way to recover makes a great deal of sense to us. And so I'm going to end there. I have additional items I could cover, but I want to thank you. I've tried to move from the science of clean energy to the implementation to some of the social and racial issues. And I hope overall this really provides a picture of the landscape of our energy technologies. Then I'll return it back to the end to questions. And so let me exit the presenter mode and we'll go back to a dialogue. So I'll stop sharing, and I thank you all for listening online.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamen, for this, very quick tour in the world of energy. And actually, you, I think, managed to cover a lot. I mean, in this very short period, and also to clarify the relationship between, COVID and energy and research in this area also, with all these experiences you shared with us, and the technologies, and what's going on in the world. And it seems there's a lot going on now in renewable energy and alternative energies. Let's start to go to these questions now posed by some of your audiences. But before that, I would like to ask a question myself. And this is something going on in my mind for a long time now. In 90s, I was doing my master's degree in the UK, and I read a book that was describing the world in 2030. And there was a figure kept coming up all the time. After 50 years, we're going to run out of oil, and we'll start to use other source of energy. And every time, actually, I get this figure, but still the world is not changing. So my question is, in your view and your experience, when we'll see a major paradigm shift in energy in the world?
Yeah, this is a great question, because this idea of peak coal and peak oil and peak gas. In the United States, we like to joke that we think we have now reached peak American football because we have it on too much of the time on television. And so this idea of peak commodities is very interesting, because you're absolutely right. We've predicted we would be at peak and running out of fossil fuels for some time, and clearly we have not. Even those that we thought were becoming scarce, such as natural gas, we've discovered more of that. We've discovered, in fact, that there's so much fossil fuels that the transition will not come because we run out of them. We're changing the atmosphere so significantly that what we're not running out of is the resource. What we're running out of is atmosphere to place the waste. And so your question of when will we make the transition is an interesting one, because I would say we already know enough that in our self-interest, even for places that have become fabulously rich with fossil fuels, renewables are cheap enough that if we choose them, we can make that the next great energy story for the world. But this is one where, of course, opinions are quite divided. And so I would say the peak issue is not the question. The issue is, when do we decide that the atmosphere and the oceans are valuable enough to us that we make the transition, even though the resource is there? And I am reminded of a famous quote from from one of the early leaders in OPEC, and that was really that the Stone Age didn't end because of a lack of stones. The things changed because we decided we had the technology, we were ready for a change. And I would say the environmental story clearly sends that message, but of course it's a hard one to hear in places where fossil fuels are just such an incredibly large part of the economy.
Very interesting. And I take away from that, you say that green energy is cheaper than, fossil energy. Now, even in Oman here, some young people started now really to, put this, things on the roofs, try to get, energy, at least, for hot water or whatever. Now, there's a question from one of the audience here. What can be done to encourage using renewable energy in a country? I mean, at, a micro level, because one of the things is, as you said, I mean, you used, Google data, to find out which houses, and you did all this analysis about, who in America using, this and it doesn't use it. Now, how to go, to scale up that and to encourage, more people in society to do it, which will benefit the planet?
So, I think the experience from Germany, from Spain, from Portugal, from California, from New York, from Japan, from South Korea, from Bangladesh is very clear. If you want to bring renewables in, knowing that fossil fuels, the incumbent technology, have a great advantage. Once you're already in place, there's many parts of the infrastructure and the economic system that benefit them. So the places that have made the transition have simply called for various objectives. And what I would love to see in Muscat and everywhere would be to set targets that are a negotiation between those that want to go fast and those that want to go slow. In California, our target was to have 1 million solar roofs by 2020. When that law was passed in 2013, people thought it was outlandish. It's not going to happen. It's crazy. We met that goal 6 months early. We hit 1 million solar rooftops. 1 out of every 15 homes, 1 out of every 15 buildings in the state has solar on it. We met that in 2019, and we've now set a new target for 2025. And that's the same in Germany with their feed-in tariff, basically an economic incentive for homeowners and businesses to install solar. And that's where this starts. We know the technology is there, but it really does require changes in the rules at utilities. Sometimes they fight it, sometimes they assist it, but it's a policy choice. And once the policy choice is made, then the good economics can take over. But if you don't open the market, you don't get the transition.
Okay, speaking about the market, we've got some students among our audience today, and they, asking questions about, employment in the sector of energy. And my question here is about, the relative absence of energy sector in these, lists we received from McKinsey and from UNESCO and others about, future jobs. Okay, they focus on robots, to focus on, IT and other things, but energy is relatively absent there. How do you explain that?
So my answer is part science and part politics, unfortunately. In fact, energy is the first or second largest industry on the planet, depending how you count. Food is the largest if we count people who are involved in even subsistence, but energy is the largest if we use a metric based on jobs in the commercial sector. And what's interesting is that while attention to jobs, in particular in the Gulf, in the oil and gas sector gets all the attention, for every dollar or euro or dinar invested in new projects, more jobs are obtained by investing the same amount of money in renewable energy than in fossil fuels. Now, this is not a well-known feature because obviously in the Gulf, in Texas, in Venezuela, we see many more fossil fuel jobs. But in California, in Germany, we have more people employed in solar than in all the other parts combined. And that's because even though the fuel is free, there's installation jobs, there's cleaning jobs, it's more job producing. And for the economists, for the business people, for your modern college business, this shouldn't be surprising, because if the fuel is free, of course, the money is going into salaries, knowledge creation, and companies. The reason why we're not used to thinking that way, and this is where the politics really comes in, is that globally, governments of the world subsidize fossil fuels somewhere between $500 billion and $5 trillion a year. It's not a bad thing, but it's a choice. And we don't subsidize renewable energy anywhere near the same way. Now, many people will say, well, that's the way it is. We're set there. But if we're subsidizing fossil fuels more than we're even investing in renewables, it makes it hard to see those jobs. But again, California and Germany stand out as places where the jobs are very clearly in the clean energy space, not on the fossil side. So your students are asking a very interesting question about what it is we choose to subsidize at our state, provincial, and national levels.
And how that impact the whole, market of, employment and the students and that. Now, another question about reliability, okay, of renewable energy. The question is it reliable and powerful enough for, domestic house and business at the same time, worldwide?
So this is interesting. 10 years ago, my answer would not have been yes, but today it is yes. I showed you examples of the batteries. In fact, those batteries in electric vehicles are now low enough cost that in many homes, in particular in the Gulf with such wonderful solar resources, installing rooftop solar from your home or business and a battery in the garage, or just using your electric vehicle as the battery, means that even when you don't have sun because of clouds, because of monsoons, because of nighttime, it's cheaper to go with renewables. The city of Berlin has enough storage built around the city so that they can last for 4 days with no sun and wind on the batteries installed. In California, our regulator, the Public Utilities Commission, has said that we will no longer license new natural gas plants because they don't take us towards our green energy goal, but instead we will install storage, like the plant I showed you near Los Angeles, so we can back up solar and wind with storage. And it still is cheaper than fossil fuel projects.
Okay, great. It seems to me like, you have stimulate, appetite among some business students who have in the college. They're asking about, how, to set up a company, in the, energy industry, okay, a small company or medium size, how they can do that. They want them really to enter in this, market, as business students, and they want, to do something about that. Instead of, doing, business in other sectors, why they don't, come in with this energy and, skill and, do business in energy?
So now the students are talking my language, because I moved to Berkeley from Princeton University 20 years ago, specifically because Berkeley is part of Silicon Valley here in Northern California. In fact, Stanford and Berkeley compete each year to say which university has started more companies, have encouraged our students, some in schools of business, some in engineering, some in others, software, to really launch new companies. And many of the famous companies, of course, that we all use, the Facebook, Apple, Google, these are Silicon Valley products, but increasingly energy companies, Tesla and others, Solar City companies are also launched in the same area. And one of the things that's been very successful here in helping students to move into this less familiar area of clean energy is actually to have competitions. Berkeley, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, ETH in Switzerland, Imperial College in London, they all run competitions and challenges to give students money for good ideas in the clean energy space. And many of the companies that now exist in this area started by teams of students that were encouraged by money that the universities provided or that the government provided to universities for clean tech competitions. And one of the things that I really recommend is to think about that. So when I was a science envoy, I worked with the government of Morocco and their MASEN, the Ministry of Sustainable Energy, to establish a so-called Silicon Desert, not Silicon Valley, but Silicon Desert for them, based in Casablanca, where they supported students quite significantly, with €500,000 a time to launch clean energy companies. That money came from the king, and it was given to student teams that had ideas for good companies, financial companies to help you install and amortize solar, companies to do basic research on batteries or energy efficiency. And one of the ways that we kick off new companies is to give them those stimulus packages. And this is not unique to clean energy. If we go back and look in the 1910s and 20s, we saw similar innovation grants given to students in the United States to go into oil and gas. And then, of course, when it grew so massively, they weren't needed. But that's the point we are in clean energy. And so Morocco is a wonderful example of doing just that. And I do recommend looking at the places that have found ways through universities to seed students with those grants and the mentorship needed. Because it's not just money, it's also, have you met anyone in the clean energy space? A trip to Kuwait, thought of for its oil and its refineries, but a trip to the Al Shagaya Clean Energy Park that's already providing almost 20% of energy in Kuwait. That was a joint effort from KISR, the National Scientific Agency, and a number of these oil and gas funds to really spur this. So these are examples to me where you're making it happen.
That's interesting, very interesting. Now, you mentioned about the political will, in order to get this agenda across. I mean, and improve what we are doing in terms of renewable energy. My question is about networks, technical networks. Okay, apart from international organizations where they design some tools and instruments to facilitate dialogue and conversation about energy. From your experience, do we have enough kind of networking globally about energy and to serve the energy agenda?
So this is a great. Thank you for asking, because one of the things that we've seen is that as the prices of renewables have fallen, they've moved much more clearly into our traditional networks. So the largest professional society in the world is the Electrical Engineering Society, the so-called IEEE. I didn't know it was the biggest because as a physicist, I don't think much about it, but I was recently elected to be a fellow of the IEEE. And they have started an off-grid, a mini-grid part of the effort. And what they've discovered, interesting for your students, is that while we have lots of power engineers who can work on solar systems and on inverters, the technology to take the direct current from the solar cell to make alternating current, they lack people on the business side that are experienced with renewables. And so often it's a partnership between an engineer and a business student that makes a company go. And so what the IEEE, the largest technical society, is doing is looking for partners. So in Morocco, they have a school of business and data science at Mohammed VI University. And at that university in Rabat, they have a partnership now between the College of Engineering and this newly evolved school of data and business. And they're finding this is a very productive place to build partnerships, to build these new companies and these teams to go out and really make this transition. So I think that we do have those networks, but we're not used to using them in the energy field, in the transition so much.
Wait, maybe it's a matter of time and things are moving forward. Absolutely. In that direction. Now, Professor Kamen, being an academic yourself, and looking at the programs available now in universities around the world, what will be your list of, wishes, things that, should be included, in preparing, future generations?
Yeah. So I think this is why the story in Morocco might be so interesting, because I was working at the World Bank when the king came to the World Bank and said he wanted to help Morocco become a leader in solar and in wind. And today, Morocco is the only country, not Denmark, not Germany, not the United States, certainly, that is on pace to meet those Paris climate goals. And Morocco didn't do it just by installing large-scale solar and wind, but also by transitioning the university system. And so energy engineering is now the largest major at many of the universities in Morocco. And it partners in business, it partners in basic science, it partners in economics, in English, in other fields. And what they've really found is that having enough people who are experienced in the area is more important than the solar resource, which of course is wonderful in Morocco. But what they really needed was to transition the workforce. And so the universities have taken this on. So here at Berkeley, the two fastest growing majors, undergraduate degrees, are data science and energy engineering. And these are the types of areas, but I'm hoping to see at more and more universities to really be that face of that future. So AI, data science, machine learning, and energy. Those are the new majors that I'm hoping we'll see at every university around the world.
Great. I think the university should play, and college should play, a greater role in this area, I guess. Now, Professor Kamen, here is $1 million question. Okay. Sometimes we get very excited with this kind of new trend, whether in energy or in any other field, and we tend to neglect or forget about the negative side or consequences or challenges associated with this. Now, as an expert in this area, what are the challenges associated with the renewable energy? We know about the benefits. We know about the wonderful kind of promises we get from experts in this area. But are there any hazards or things that we need to be aware of or careful about?
Yeah, there really are. I mean, all these energy technologies, both those that we consider fossil and renewable, all have a downside. And certainly one of the practical downsides for renewables is the issue you mentioned before. It's not just about having solar when the sun is on. Here, after all, it's early morning here in California, but it's foggy, so my solar on my roof is producing no energy. And so I need storage. And so the transition to clean energy requires energy storage as well as generation. So that's a resource question. But at the same time, we also know that all of the devices we have, our cell phones, the lithium-ion batteries in our electric vehicles, this comes from different parts of the world. And unfortunately, right now, many of the materials that go into our electronics are involved in conflict, in particular in the Congo, where many of the materials, the tantalum, the strontium, many of the things we need for our devices comes from areas where there's conflict. And geopolitics, unfortunately, likes conflict. We like to have areas like Afghanistan, like the Congo, where different sides are keeping battles alive so that they can extract the materials without reimbursing the people or the government. So one of the things that the clean energy field needs is a social conscience. We need to recognize that even if the cheapest lithium or the cheapest tantalum comes from the Congo, it might not be environmentally just. It might be discriminating against women, against tribal minorities. And so paying an extra amount to see that we invest in these areas, not just to compensate them for what we take, but to make the extractions more sustainable. That's the piece that the clean energy transition needs. And so the prices I quoted were all true, but we do know that for the laptop I'm giving this talk on, for our cell phone, that we are all supporting and buying conflict materials because these parts of the world are suffering so that we can benefit. And so we are going to have to expand our economic sense and our sense of being brothers and sisters with people around the planet to make the clean energy transition also one that doesn't emphasize the problems, the lack of these materials, the lack of good governance in the countries that we're tearing apart to get them.
Okay, now my last question is, 50% by 2030. That's feasible?
So it's not only feasible, but for the last month, California has been at 69, 70, 71% renewables. So it is certainly feasible. Now, I also didn't mention nuclear or large hydro. When we count those in our mix as well, which don't count towards our clean energy target, but they're low carbon.
By the way, why you didn't count them? By the way, just for my curiosity.
So it's a great question. Like I said, the definition varies. In New York State, where I'm from, we count nuclear and we count large hydro. California, we don't. We don't for two reasons. California has decided that we have enough sun and wind that we don't want to build more dams on our rivers because of ecology. We want to preserve fish. We want to preserve the oxygen levels. So we've said no more dams. And in fact, in California and British Columbia, we are now tearing down dams. We're going back to the river. Nuclear is another story. I am a professor of nuclear engineering, so I would very much like to see nuclear as part of the mix. But California, in my opinion, made the correct decision 30 years ago to say that the technology for nuclear waste storage or reprocessing was not good enough. So we chose in California not to make nuclear part of our near-term transition. That's different. Obviously, France embraces nuclear, China embraces nuclear. California, at one time, we planned to have a nuclear power plant every 20 miles along our 900-kilometer coastline. Every 14 kilometers, every 35 kilometers, we were going to have a nuclear plant. California has one nuclear plant today, not several hundred. And California is closing that last plant 2 decades early. So opinions differ. California has a wonderful mix of solar and wind. Other places, have less so. And so I think that's a choice. I like California's definition, but as someone who's from New York, I also respect New York's choice, which is largely to count large hydro as well as solar and wind. And much of New York's large hydro actually comes from Canada. So the definitions vary.
Professor Daniel Kamen, thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm very glad and happy to know from you as an expert that the Gulf area has got great potential with the renewable energy. This is good news for us and for the future, with this, 50-year, span. They're telling us that, the oil is going to last. Then at least we've got, some other potentials there around in the area. Thank you very much for being with us today and for responding to all these questions from our students, from other audience from outside. And thank you very much for our audience for joining us. And thank you for the team also, and Professor Ahmed Nouamani, who heard something about electrical engineering. I think that's his area, and we'll be very happy with that. Hopefully we're going to meet again in our next webinar, which is about deploying IoT against COVID-19 spreading, which will be delivered by Nebogsa Bashanin, and that will be 8th of July. So thank you everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll meet you again next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.